Welcome back to Inside Story. Tonight we're asking whether North and South Korea can be reunited. Well, since the peninsula split into two countries in 1945, people on either side of the border have led very different lives. This is life in South Korea's capital, Seoul. Congested and modern, the city is one of the most crowded in the world and one of the richest. Just across the demilitarized zone, life in North Korea's capital is quite different. There, the streets of Pyongyang are lined with patriotic statues and murals. And the city looks modern, but despite the capital's clean surface, food shortages and poverty plague the country. If North and South Korea are ever to achieve unification, it will be costly and slow. Both sides bring their own concerns and demands to the negotiating table. Well, Seoul wants the North to halt its nuclear program in line with international demands. As well, it seeks the removal of restrictions on family reunions amongst those living on either side of the border. Equally important, Seoul is eager to avoid any collapse in the North, which would likely trigger millions of refugees spilling over the border, imposing a massive burden on the South. Well, for its part, Pyongyang seeks normalization with South Korea in order to reach out to the United States. Pyongyang wants economic aid from the United States, South Korea and Japan to prop up its ailing economy. Politically, it demands normalization with the US, including the lifting of all sanctions and the establishment of full diplomatic ties. And more concretely, it wants a non-aggression pact with the US. Well, a simple comparison between the economies of both Koreas shows how wide the gap is between the two sides. As one of the world's most centrally planned and isolated economies, North Korea's per capita income is about $1,800 a year. Meanwhile, South Korea is one of Asia's most affluent. Here, the per capita income is about $25,000 a year. The annual growth rate also varies. North Korea's economy growing by only 1.6%. Its southern neighbor, on the other hand, growing by about 5% a year. Of course, North Korea is one of the world's top recipients of foreign aid too. Well, last year they received $118 million worth of aid, while South Korea has donated more than $700 million during the same period. Well, joining us once again are our guests in London, James Horn, expert on Korean affairs and the first British chargé d'affaires in North Korea. In Washington, D.C., Scott Snyder, Senior Associate at the Asia Foundation. And on the line from Seoul in South Korea, Jung-Hoon Kim, a reporter for the Korea Herald. Thanks for joining us once again. If I could start with James, from your understanding of North Korean politics, is North Korea really hoping to use this summit as perhaps a stepping stone to improve ties with Washington?
I'm sure that's at the back of many North Korean actions. But there is, of course, the separate channel of the six-party talks, theoretically on nuclear matters, but now expanded to include other things as well. So although I think North Korea will look for some South Korean support in its attempts to improve relations with Washington, I think that we must also take account of the increasingly direct contacts there are between North Korea and Washington, which of course is one reason why the South Koreans want to keep in action with North Korea. They don't want to be sidelined in this particular game.
Right, that's an interesting point. Let's take that to Scott Snyder. Are we likely to see, given what we were just talking about there, of increasing direct contacts between the United States and North Korea, are we likely to see perhaps a visit by the US Secretary of State to North Korea along the similar lines of what happened after the last summit between the two Korean leaders back in 2000?
Well, I think it would be premature to speculate about whether there might be a visit by Secretary of State Rice. One thing that we don't know yet is the outcome of a six-party meeting that just took place in Beijing. And the result was supposed to be announced from Beijing on Tuesday, but it is not yet out. If there is continued progress on North Korea's denuclearization in return for steps toward political normalization, and if that process goes far enough, then it might be possible to see there certainly will be higher level contact, including a planned foreign ministers meeting among the six parties that could take place even before the end of the year.
But how much support is there from Washington at this point for this sort of contact between the two Korean leaders? I mean, you had James there a minute ago sort of hinting at the rivalry almost between the two allies, the US and South Korea, and how they deal with North Korea.
Well, I think that's one of the key issues related to the summit that we want to sort of see how it plays out, and that's whether or not the summit and the six-party talks process end up reinforcing each other, or whether they end up being at odds with each other. And I think that a lot of that is going to depend on how Kim Jong-il decides to play his hand. There is a possibility that they could be mutually reinforcing, but obviously there also has been a kind of competition, perceived competition between the objectives of denuclearization of North Korea and the objective of improving the inter-Korean relationship.
All right, let's go over to South Korea. And Ji-Hyun, there's been some sentiment in South Korea lately about allowing the Americans perhaps to call too many of the shots when it comes to politics in the Korean peninsula. How is all of that going to play out? What do people think that perhaps it's time for them to take back some of the initiative?
Well, I think that also regarding that, the sentiment is 50-50, meaning that there are, of course, an increasing number of South Koreans who believe that South Korea needs to hold on to the guns and, I guess, as you said, call the shots more. And I think I think this is the kind of sentiment that led to the past 10 years of rule under President Kim Dae-jung and the current president, Moo-Hyun. However, I think there are also some concerns that perhaps this is not the best card to play because, as you know, there have been concerns in and out of the country regarding South Korea's relations with the United States, which is its largest ally. So I think in that aspect, again, we have concerns and also, of course, some people who want to have a bigger say.
Let's talk a little bit, on the other hand, about China's deepening economic ties with South Korea. How is that changing the policies and concerns and calculations of South Korea? I think its trade with China is more than its trade with the United States.
Right. I mean, China has, as everybody knows, China has become a very large player in international politics. And of course, given its geographical position and political relations in Northeast Asia, China is not a player that South Korea can afford to ignore, and that will play into the political cards. And at the moment, I think there is sentiment in South Korea that it needs to see China as both a partner and, of course, as a competitor as well. And at this point, however, I think the sentiment is leaning more towards seeing China as a partner in order to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons and come back to the global society.
All right, let's go over to James Hoare in London. For a long time, the Bush administration seemed to be against moving too quickly, opening up direct talks to North Korea. All that seems to have changed just a few months ago. Why? Is it because the Chinese perhaps were making too many friends in the bloc?
I'm not quite sure why. Perhaps Scott Snyder might be in a better position than me. But I have heard it argued, and I can see the force of the argument, that the United States began to realize that with two very difficult wars in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, it didn't want a third and a potential conflict with Iran. It didn't want continued problems on the Korean Peninsula. And by moving a little towards North Korea, in terms of direct talks in the context of the six-party talks, admittedly, it was able to get that particular political problem moving a bit. And so I think the United States reasons are somewhere in the need for the Bush administration not to have a whole set of cards against it, and it has played the North Korean card. Right. Just on the question of China, if I may, the Chinese, of course, are also very important economically and politically to North Korea as well as to South Korea. There's a lot of Chinese investment, growing Chinese investment. Right. And the Chinese, while taking part in the six-party talks, have to some extent acted as the North Koreans' friend. So that, in a sense, has also advantages for South Korea as well in dealing with China.
Right, well, I'm afraid we are running out of time. We'll have to thank our guests, James Hoare, Scott Snyder and Ji-Hyun Kim from Korea. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.